Alrighty, so let's talk about the Middle Colonies. What we consider Middle Colonies for those days, we here in Texas in the 21st century would definitely consider these to be, at least I would consider these to be northeastern colonies. We're talking about New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So these are pretty far north and east for us. But back in those days, when you're talking about just the eastern seaboard, these are considered middle colonies. New York and New Jersey, I look at these as being, New Jersey being the little sister to New York. It's like, and you'll see why in just a minute. They're grouped together because of their location. They both use the Hudson River as transportation, and the rivers that were available to the colonists back in those days were all used like highways, because that's what they had. They didn't have really a lot of roads. The area was originally called New Netherland because it was settled and controlled by the Dutch originally. And a lot of the street names and place names in the New York area still have Dutch names, and you will notice that if you go there to visit. A little out of kilter here. Okay. All right. So the Dutch West India Company used something called the patroon system, in which large land grants were given to people who would agree to bring people, 50 settlers, to work the land. Now, this sounds a lot like the impresario system that the Spanish had used, and there's a reason for that. The Dutch looked at what the Spanish had done with settling North America and saw that it had been very successful, and so they used that, and they modeled after it, and they used this patroon system. The patroons then would rule that land. They didn't necessarily own it all, although in some cases they did, but they would rule over the land. They were the last word on the subject. They were the ones who made all the rules and regulations for the place. Settlers would work the land, and they would owe the patroon a certain percentage of crops from the land. Now that should sound very familiar to you. All of that should sound very familiar. Okay. New Netherland becomes New York. Now, how does that happen? I mean, we just don't. It doesn't happen because the Dutch decided to just hand it over to England. That's not how it works. Because what happened was there had been an English settler in the area in the late 1400s, and that's really early on. That's very, very early. His name was John Cabot. And so the British did have some knowledge of the area, and they sent a fleet in 1664. Again, now we're down the road in time. Remember, 1620 was Plymouth. 1664 is several generations down the road. So they sent this fleet in 1664 saying, oh, our guy was there first, and so we should take it over from you. And honestly, Britain is the biggest, baddest dog on the planet right now. And so when they sent a fleet to New York, the Dutch governor there didn't give him much of a fight. He surrendered pretty much without a fight. King Charles gave the area to his brother. And now the brother is always known as the Duke of York. The king's brother is always the Duke of York. There's a Duke of York right now, and he is the king's brother. When the new king becomes king, his brother will be the Duke of York. That's how it is. That's how it's always been. That's how it is. And that's how we get New York. It's named after the king's brother, who owned the land because the king gave it to him. I don't know if the king's brother ever came there to even see the land. I'm not sure he did. He may have. It's not something that I'm well versed on. I will be glad to tell you as we go through this school year. There are some things I know backwards and forwards, and I know things in depth on it. This is not one of them. I do know that Britain took New York or New Netherland away from the Dutch without a fight, and that the king gave it to his brother, the Duke of York, and that's how it gets its name. Okay, so I don't know if the brother ever came to visit it. Now, this thing is called a proprietary colony, and that is important. A proprietary colony means there's someone owns it. You can see property is kind of in that word. And the owner makes all the decisions himself. So there's no House of Burgesses, there's no all the male members of a church make a decision or something like that. The owner makes all the decisions. So the Duke of York is going to be making all the decisions on that colony. Or if he sends people there to be his representative, which is what happens, then they will be making all the decisions on the colony. New York is a prosperous colony, even right off from the beginning. And now you need to know what is their economy? What do they do to be so prosperous? Well, they can chop down trees, which we will learn is a huge important thing for England because England's running out of trees. And lumber is the oil of the day. And so they can chop down trees and send it back to England. They have fishing, it's rich fishing grounds right there. Whaling is important, and they have good natural harbors there in New York. It still is a huge natural port. It's one of the biggest ports in the United States. And so that's how they make their money. Fishing, whaling, lumber, and trade. And it becomes a very prosperous little colony. They also have a diverse population. It's not like the Dutch all had to leave when the Duke of York took over. He didn't shoo them all out. Some of them probably chose to leave, but the ones who had been there from the beginning probably chose to stay. They're like, well, if you don't bother us and we just can stay and keep on having our little business here, why would we go away just because the Duke of York owns it now? We can still stay here and have our little business. It's okay. All right. And since this colony was based on economics, not religion, like the New England colonies with the Puritans, this colony was based purely on economics. People from any place were welcome, really. I mean, Jewish people were welcome. Protestant people were welcome. Catholic people were welcome. Native American and German people, all kinds of people were living there. It was multicultural, just kind of like it is today. All right, so how do we get New Jersey? Because all of it was New York at first. But the Duke of York decided to divide off part of it and give it to a couple of his best friends. When you don't need to know these for a test. As far as I know, these will never be on a test. But it's interesting, how do we get New Jersey? Okay, it didn't just happen. He decided to break some off and give it to his friends, John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. And they named their piece of land New Jersey after Jersey, England. So New York, New Jersey. And they offered large tracts of land on one big selling point, and they offered also freedom of religion. They also offered trial by jury and a representative assembly, which they didn't have to do because it's a proprietary colony, but they're going to offer representation to the people who live there. So that's a selling point. And they get people to come to New Jersey. And again, there are advantages to that. So people are, excited to come there. All right, how do we get Pennsylvania? Now, this little guy up in the corner ought to look familiar to you. You ought to all be familiar with this guy. And I'm going to go into depth on him in a little bit. The Quakers are a Protestant group. Remember I told you there's all different kinds of Protestant groups. Well, the Quakers were one of them. And they were persecuted in England, just like the Puritans had been. And they left for the same reason, because they were being persecuted. They were pacifists. They believed in nonviolence. They weren't going to partake in any war. And they wanted out. Now, William Penn was a wealthy Quaker. It's actually the son of a wealthy Quaker. And the king owed the father a debt, owed money to the father of him, and offered to pay it off, King Charles did, by giving him land in North America to take all of his little Quaker friends over there, just get out of Dodge and go over there with your little Quaker friends. And so that's how Pennsylvania came to be, obviously named after William Penn. The Quakers are also called Society of Friends, and I see that's blocked off by my little talking space again. And they believe everyone is equal. Now, of course, equal is not the same thing as we think of today, being equal. Although women were given more rights in those days by the Quakers than any other group at that point. And, women were allowed to have voting rights in the church and things like that, whereas in other areas, women had no rights whatsoever, none. The city of Philadelphia was the main city there, it's a port city, and it's the city of brotherly love. That's what Philadelphia means, the city of brotherly love. And Quakers, especially Penn, believed that even Native Americans had rights, and you just don't take their land away from them, you should pay them for their land, which was a really novel concept for those times, because mostly, even by people who got along well with the Native Americans, they were viewed as sort of savages. I mean, they didn't really view them as equals at all. Okay, so who lived there? Penn advertises his colony all over Europe, and by 1683, there's people from all over Europe living there, from England, from Wales, Ireland, Netherlands, Germany. They're all living there in Pennsylvania, and they're happy. Now, you don't have to be Quaker to live there, but you have to kind of go along with their ideas. You're not going to be able to, the Puritans aren't going to fit in there, okay? You would have to be tolerant of other religions in order to fit in there, I think. And in 1701, Penn gave the Charter of Privileges to the colonists, which made them have an elected legislature. Now, that's good on the one hand, but it's bad on the other hand because that's how he ends up losing control of the area that he called Delaware, or that ends up being Delaware, because these people start electing their own legislature and they want to break away, which, it's not that big of a deal, but that's how it happened. Okay, one of the things I think is so important for you to know, and it's important to learn it now, and you need to know it going forward for the future, for the rest of the school year. Most Quakers never believed in slavery, and one of the first groups to work against slavery and help slaves escape. Because of their view of pacifism and equality, slavery was never a thing they ever believed in. And you need to remember that because it's important, because they become one of the very first people in the abolition movement later on, before the Civil War, and they become some of the first people to actually help slaves escape before the Civil War and during the Civil War. The main economy of that area in Pennsylvania, the Middle Colonies are called the bread colonies because they grew a lot of wheat. We don't think of it as being a wheat growing region, but I can show you on the map at school that if you draw lines of latitude across the United States, you will see that New York and Pennsylvania will come right across Nebraska and Kansas area where we grow an awful lot of wheat right now. So a lot of wheat was grown there, and they were referred to as the bread colonies. Penn's image is what you see on the Quaker Oats can now, the little cardboard box of Quaker Oats when you go to the grocery store with your mom. You probably don't like Quaker Oats, but his image is on other oatmeal products. And of course, where do we get the oats? We get those things from wheat. So it all ties in together. It's an easy way to remember it. Okay, so I taught you a little bit about how we got Delaware. People from Sweden settled a lot in southern Pennsylvania even before the Dutch and then the English took over. And so when Penn allowed them to form their little assemblies, they did, and eventually became so divergent from the rest of from the rest of Pennsylvania that they just wanted to form their own little place called Delaware, and he let them. I mean, it was not a very big piece of land. It still isn't a very big piece of land. I think maybe Greater Houston is that big. I'm probably exaggerating, but I mean, it's just not a very big piece of land. And so he's like, okay, go ahead and do your own thing down there. That's fine. Like I said, he's a pacifist. They want to get along with everybody. That's their idea.